The scent of lilies and buttercream, cloying and suffocatingly familiar, assaulted my senses. It was a scent I intimately associated with my own agonizing death. My sister, Livia, stood radiant beside the towering wedding cake, a confection of pristine white frosting and delicate sugar flowers. A silver knife glinted wickedly in her perfectly manicured hand. "To the happy couple!" she chirped, her voice a melodious lie. Her eyes, usually so sharp with unconcealed envy, now unnervingly soft with feigned affection. It was the exact same cake, the same saccharine smile that stretched too wide, the same undercurrent of pure malice I'd tasted, quite literally, just before the world had dissolved into agonizing darkness in my previous life. This time, however, I was not the naive, trusting fool. This time, I was awake, acutely aware, my senses screaming. This time, I knew the bitter almond tang, the signature of cyanide, hidden beneath the layers of sweet sugar and false sentiment. It was my wedding day, again. A scene ripped from my nightmares and replayed with horrifying fidelity. But I was no longer the unsuspecting bride destined for a tragic end. My groom, Daniel, a genuinely kind, unassuming man, a universe away from the feckless Marcus of my past life, smiled warmly beside me, blissfully, dangerously oblivious. The lights of the grand ballroom seemed to dim. The cheerful chatter of guests faded into a dull roar. The real performance, my performance, was about to begin. My internal monologue was a raging storm, contrasting this horrifyingly familiar moment with the vivid, searing memory of my agonizing death. The fire in my throat, the paralysis, Livia's fleeting, triumphant smirk as I collapsed. The air in the opulent reception hall felt thick, heavy, each breath a struggle against the rising panic I had to suppress. I forced a smile onto my lips, a brittle imitation of bridal joy, the muscles in my face aching with the effort. The weight of my foreknowledge of the impending, repeated betrayal pressed down on me, a physical burden. I could almost feel the phantom pain, the ghostly grip of death from my first life, its icy tendrils reaching for me even now. Livia's subtle, almost imperceptible smirk, a tiny quirk of her lips as she caught my eye, was a detail only I, with the grim advantage of hindsight, could decipher. It was a silent acknowledgement of her intent, a chilling confirmation. The ticking clock in my mind hammered a frantic rhythm, each second stretching into an eternity as Livia postured, preparing to cut the cake. The oppressive sweetness of the lilies, the rustle of Livia's expensive silk dress like a viper slithering, the low, expectant murmur of the guests, all amplified. I felt the cold, clammy sweat on my palms, praying it wasn't visible. My gaze was locked on Livia's hand, the ornate silver knife, the deceptively innocent cake, the stage for her treachery, and now for my first act of silent retribution. Livia raised the knife high, a theatrical flourish for the assembled guests. Her gaze flicked to mine for a nanosecond, a spark of hidden, malicious challenge in their depths. Would I scream? Disrupt the charade? Expose her now? Or was my own, carefully laid plan already irrevocably in motion? Just as Livia was about to make the first incision, I feigned a sudden violent coughing fit. I doubled over slightly, my hand flying to my throat. "Water," I gasped, creating a minor, believable commotion. Daniel, ever solicitous, rushed to my side, his brow furrowed with concern. In the ensuing brief, carefully orchestrated chaos guest turning, a waiter fumbling with a water pitcher I accidentally jostled, causing a momentary shuffle near the cake table. Away from the cake itself, a precise, calculated near miss. My loyal, discreetly hired caterer moved. Mrs. Albright, a woman whose loyalty I'd secured with a significant sum and the promise of future lucrative contracts, acted with practiced, almost invisible speed. She subtly swapped the entire top tier of the cake, the one Livia was theatrically aiming for, with an identical, untainted one for Daniel and me. More importantly, the specific slice Livia was poised to cut for herself was replaced with one specially prepared according to my explicit, vengeful instructions. Livia, momentarily flustered by the disruption, but quickly recovering her poisonous composure, insisted on proceeding. "Must have been nerves," she trilled, patting my arm with false concern before turning back to her task. With a flourish, she cut a generous slice from her designated section. The section I had ensured contained not deadly poison, but a potent, fast-acting, and thoroughly humiliating laxative. "To seal the good wishes," she declared, inventing a tradition on the spot, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness as she lifted the fork. And I shall take the very first bite for luck. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but my outward demeanor remained one of fragile recovery from my coughing fit. I watched, every nerve ending alight, as Mrs. Albright, a stern-faced woman with surprisingly nimble fingers, executed the swap with the precision of a seasoned spy. Livia's inherent arrogance and her insatiable desire to be the center of attention played directly into my hands. Her insistence on cutting the cake and tasting it first was a predictable move I had counted on. The guests, momentarily distracted, refocused on the cake-cutting ritual, their faces alight with anticipation. Daniel squeezed my hand, his concern for me genuine and heartwarming, a stark contrast to the cold calculation I saw in Livia's eyes. The rich, sweet aroma of the wedding cake, once a harbinger of my doom, now filled my nostrils with the scent of impending, albeit minor, justice. I kept my expression carefully neutral, a mask of bridal innocence, as I watched Livia lift the fork to her lips. The delicate crumb, the creamy frosting. I imagined the texture, her initial satisfaction, the complete unawareness of the unpleasant surprise awaiting her digestive system. Livia swallowed the bite with a self-satisfied sigh, a triumphant, almost predatory glint in her eye, as she briefly met my gaze. I waited, my breath held. The game was afoot. How long until the carefully chosen concoction took its embarrassing effect? The wedding reception was in full swing. Speeches were being made, champagne flowed, and the dance floor was beginning to fill. Livia, naturally, was flitting from group to group, soaking up attention, her laughter a little too loud, her gestures a little too theatrical. I watched her from across the room, a small, secret smile playing on my lips. It was during her animated conversation with a wealthy, influential distant uncle, a man whose favor she was desperately trying to curry, that the first signs appeared. Her vivacious smile began to falter, replaced by a subtle wince. A fine sheen of sweat beaded on her perfectly powdered forehead. Her hand, adorned with sparkling rings, crept towards her stomach, pressing lightly. The vibrant, artificial blush on her cheeks seemed to drain away, leaving behind a pale, sickly green tinge that clashed horribly with her expensive designer gown. Her movements became jerky, her social graces deserting her as she made a hasty, remarkably undignified exit. She practically sprinted towards the grandly appointed ladies' restrooms, abandoning the bewildered uncle mid-sentence. A ripple of whispers, like a sudden breeze through dry leaves, erupted among the nearby guests. I maintained an air of innocent, sisterly concern, even turning to Daniel and murmuring, "Oh dear, Livia doesn't look well at all. Perhaps someone should check on her?" Daniel, bless his unsuspecting heart, immediately expressed genuine worry. The stark, almost comical contrast between Livia's earlier poise and her current rapidly escalating distress was a sight I would cherish. The guests' speculative murmurs filled the air. Was it the shellfish? Perhaps she's just overcome with emotion. A sudden, violent stomach bug, do you think? I savored each whispered theory, my subtle satisfaction carefully concealed behind a mask of anxious solicitude. The cloying scent of lilies and Livia's expensive French perfume, which had earlier seemed to dominate the room, was now, in my imagination, mixed with the faint, unpleasant odor of her impending gastrointestinal doom as she rushed past a group of her shocked friends. I allowed myself a tiny, almost imperceptible glance towards Mrs. Albright, who stood stoically by the catering station, her expression impassive, but her eyes held a flicker of understanding. The carefully orchestrated disruption to the wedding's smooth flow, a small crack in Livia's perfect facade, was entirely my doing, a mere amuse-bouche for the banquet of revenge I had planned. Livia didn't return for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Chloe, my former best friend and Livia's current chief sycophant, was dispatched to check on her. Chloe returned minutes later, her face a mask of poorly concealed horror and disgust. What exactly had she witnessed in the opulent ladies' lounge? Chloe, looking pale and flustered, rushed back not to me but to Livia's parents. She whispered frantically with dramatic hand gestures about the appalling state of Livia and the unfortunate condition of one of the pristine restroom stalls. The official story, quickly concocted by my flustered mother, became a sudden, terribly violent stomach bug. Poor Livia. Such a delicate constitution. Livia was eventually, and very discreetly, escorted out through a side exit by her mortified parents. Her grand exit was a far cry from the triumphant appearances she usually engineered. She looked weak, humiliated, and her expensive dress was rumored to be somewhat compromised. I ensured the rest of the cake, the perfectly safe, delicious part, was enthusiastically served and enjoyed by the remaining guests. I even made a few lighthearted, innocently barbed comments about Livia's unfortunate delicate digestion and how she really shouldn't have insisted on that first piece if she was feeling peaky. Later that night, in the quiet intimacy of our bridal suite, the scent of roses and champagne filling the air, I feigned complete ignorance about Livia's plight, but I subtly planted a tiny seed of doubt in Daniel's mind. "It's so strange, darling," I mused, tracing patterns on his hand. Livia was so incredibly insistent on tasting that specific piece of cake first, almost like she knew something special about it, don't you think? Daniel, ever kind and practical, dismissed it as an unfortunate, embarrassing coincidence for Livia. But I saw a tiny, thoughtful frown crease his brow. A minuscule question mark had been successfully planted. My parents' flustered, red-faced attempts to manage appearances were almost painful to watch, yet I felt no pity. Chloe's panicked expressions and her hushed, overly dramatic retelling of Livia's bathroom catastrophe to a circle of wide-eyed acquaintances provided a certain grim amusement. My performance as the concerned, slightly bewildered sister was flawless, honed by years of observing Livia's own manipulative theatrics. The lingering scent of lilies and buttercream in the ballroom, which we left as the party wound down, was no longer a symbol of dread but a reminder of my first small, satisfying victory. Later, the quiet hum of the air conditioning in our luxurious bridal suite was a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil Livia was undoubtedly experiencing. My voice, when I spoke to Daniel, was laced with just the right amount of false innocence and sisterly concern. The comforting weight of Daniel's hand on mine, his steady presence, was a reassurance I hadn't known in my first blighted life. He was my anchor in this new reality. As I slipped out of my wedding gown, the heavy silk pooling at my feet, my eyes caught a flicker of something unnatural. Tucked deep within a large, ostentatious floral arrangement sent by a well-wisher, one I suspected was Livia's doing, I found a small, unfamiliar, expensive-looking listening device. Its tiny red light blinked faintly. Who had planted it, and more importantly, what, if anything, had they managed to overhear? The bug in the bridal suite confirmed my suspicions. Livia, despite her humiliating wedding cake incident, was already plotting. Recovering from her stomach bug, but seething with a potent cocktail of suspicion, jealousy, and wounded pride, she set her sights on ruining our meticulously planned honeymoon. Daniel and I had chosen a unique, remote, and incredibly serene eco-lodge in Costa Rica, a place requiring specific, hard-to-get bookings. Livia, I soon discovered, had wheedled the details out of a surprisingly loose-lipped Chloe, who seemed to crumble under Livia's manipulative pressure. With Chloe's reluctant but active assistance, Livia systematically canceled our exclusive reservations. She used spoofed emails and exploited minor security loopholes I had deliberately left open as bait. Not content with merely ruining our trip, she also orchestrated a series of fake emergency calls to Daniel's demanding workplace, fabricating urgent project crises to try and get him recalled. To complete her sabotage, she began spreading insidious rumors amongst our social circle and family. I was a spendthrift, forcing Daniel into an extravagant trip he couldn't truly afford, or he secretly didn't even want to go on. She painted me as a controlling, inconsiderate new wife. Her goal was clear: to isolate me, make me appear foolish and demanding, and to drive a wedge between me and Daniel. I discovered the cancellations when a carefully crafted confirmation email I'd set up to monitor our bookings bounced back with an invalid reservation notice. The wave of cold dread that washed over me was entirely feigned. I had anticipated Livia's interference. I put on a convincing performance of shock and devastation for Daniel, my voice trembling as I showed him the cancellation notices. The rich, comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee in our sunlit kitchen did little to dispel the manufactured gloom as we discussed the sudden, inexplicable issues with our dream trip. Livia's subsequent phone call, her voice dripping with cloying, false sympathy when she heard about our honeymoon problems from a concerned Chloe, was almost enough to make me laugh. "Oh, Ilara, darling, that's simply dreadful. Is there anything at all I can do?" she cooed, the malice barely concealed beneath the saccharine veneer. Chloe, when I subtly questioned her about how Livia might have found out such specific details, stammered and avoided my gaze, her awkwardness a clear admission of her complicity. The game, it seemed, was escalating. Just as Daniel was on the phone trying to salvage the situation, a sleek courier arrived with an official-looking, express-delivered letter. It was an emergency recall notice from his company's head office citing a critical system failure that required his immediate on-site presence. It looked utterly authentic. Was this Livia's masterstroke or a genuine crisis? I crumpled, or so it seemed. I expressed profound, tearful disappointment to Daniel, suggesting we postpone the honeymoon indefinitely. Perhaps we could just take a few days at a local, uninspired spa resort. I allowed him to see me defeated by the logistical nightmare of the canceled bookings and the crushing blow of his potential work recall. To Livia and Chloe, when they called again with more sympathy, I sounded utterly despondent. My voice choked with unshed tears, telling them how everything was ruined, how this was a terrible omen for our marriage. I played directly into their malicious expectations, letting them believe they had successfully shattered my happiness. I even confided in Chloe about how Daniel was now stressed and distant, subtly feeding their narrative. My apparent passivity was a carefully constructed illusion. Having anticipated Livia's interference, and having already disabled the listening device she'd planted, replacing it with a decoy that fed her innocuous, misleading conversations, I had, weeks prior, made alternative, even more luxurious and secluded honeymoon plans. I used a completely different name, a new, untraceable email address, and a secure, anonymous payment method. Our new destination was a private villa on a remote Greek island, far exceeding the Costa Rican lodge in both beauty and exclusivity. Regarding Daniel's recall, I had preemptively cultivated a discreet contact within his company's HR department, a disgruntled mid-level manager I'd once helped with a sensitive issue in my previous life's professional sphere. A quick coded text to her confirmed the recall notice was a sophisticated forgery, likely originating from an external IP address. I began meticulously gathering digital evidence of Livia and Chloe's sabotage. I traced the IP addresses from the cancellation emails, which they'd foolishly sent from a public library computer near Livia's apartment, a detail my PI easily uncovered, and carefully archived Chloe's increasingly guilt-ridden and revealing text messages. As a final touch, I leaked highly exaggerated information about our original, now very publicly canceled, expensive Costa Rican honeymoon plans to a notorious gossip-loving aunt, a woman known to be firmly in Livia's social orbit. I framed it as a tragic loss of a completely non-refundable, incredibly luxurious trip, hinting at a deposit in the tens of thousands. My true activities took place late at night, the quiet hum of my encrypted laptop the only sound in my study. The crisp, new travel documents for our secret Greek getaway felt cool and reassuring in my hands. My calm, focused demeanor when alone was a stark contrast to the outward show of distress I presented to the world, and especially to my enemies. The faint, soothing scent of lavender from a sachet tucked into my desk drawer helped keep me centered as I meticulously planned each step. The satisfying click of keys as I navigated dark web forums to learn about tracing IP addresses and forging digital breadcrumbs was a small thrill. I was weaving a web far more complex than Livia could ever imagine. Chloe, clearly feeling the pressure of her guilt or perhaps prodded by a suspicious Livia, called me. She helpfully suggested a truly terrible, cheap, and rather depressing alternative honeymoon destination, a rundown motel in a dreary seaside town. Her tone was overly bright, clearly fishing for information about my actual state of mind and current plans. How would I respond to this transparent, clumsy attempt at espionage? I gratefully accepted Chloe's terrible suggestion. I told her it was all we could afford now, and that we were just trying to make the best of a bad situation. Then, Daniel and I very publicly departed for what everyone believed was this dismal local getaway. We even posted a few deliberately bleak photos on a rarely used social media account. Meanwhile, our gossip-loving aunt, true to form, had spread the embellished story of our lost, luxurious Costa Rican trip far and wide. She emphasized the enormous, non-refundable deposit Ilara's parents had generously gifted them, a complete fabrication on my part designed to maximize Livia's anxiety. The tale grew with each telling, the wasted sum escalating to an eye-watering figure. Simultaneously, anonymous, highly credible information, carefully disseminated by me through a burner email to Daniel's HR contact, about the fake work recall notice surfaced at Daniel's company. This triggered a swift internal investigation into attempted corporate sabotage, causing significant embarrassment and scrutiny within the department Livia had targeted with her forged documents. Livia and Chloe soon heard the wildly exaggerated tales of the lost deposit and started to panic. They envisioned my parents, whom Livia knew could be quite strict about money, demanding repayment, or worse, suspecting their involvement. The news of the corporate investigation at Daniel's work only amplified their terror. The gleeful, scandalized tone of our aunt as she recounted the tragedy of our ruined honeymoon over the phone to my mother, a call I knew Livia would overhear, was music to my ears. I imagined Livia's pale, horrified face as she heard the inflated sums, the numbers ballooning with each retelling. Chloe, I heard through the grapevine, was a nervous wreck, constantly checking her phone and jumping at shadows. The official, sternly worded emails from Daniel's HR department, circulated internally and discussing the serious breach of security and malicious attempt to disrupt company operations, were a testament to the effectiveness of my anonymous tip. To twist the knife further, I sent Livia a beautifully handwritten, passive-aggressive thank you note for her concern. I mentioned how Daniel and I were trying to make the best of a much simpler trip, but were, of course, utterly heartbroken about the tens of thousands lost on the original, non-refundable bookings. I even enclosed a pressed wilting daisy, picked from the lovely grounds of our motel. A few days into our actual idyllic Greek honeymoon, from which I sent Livia no postcards, Livia received a very official, very intimidating letter. It was on the letterhead of a prestigious, though entirely fictitious, international travel consortium, Suites and Sanctuaries International. It demanded immediate and full compensation for the multiple high-value last-minute cancellations and associated damages she had orchestrated, hinting at imminent legal action and damage to her credit rating. Was I pushing them too hard, risking exposure of my own manipulations? The fake legal letter was the tipping point. Livia, terrified of being sued for a fortune she didn't possess, or worse, having her parents discover her sabotage and be forced to foot the bill, especially after the wedding cake incident had already strained their patience, approached me the moment Daniel and I returned from our dismal local trip. She didn't confess directly, of course. Her arrogance wouldn't allow for that. Instead, she fished for information, her voice laced with an uncharacteristic tremor of anxiety. "Oh, Elara," she began, her smile forced and brittle. "I heard from Aunt Carol about that dreadful travel agency, or consortium, or whatever it is. Are they really going to cause serious trouble? It sounds utterly terrifying. Is there anything I can possibly do to help, you know, smooth things over with them?" Her eyes darted around nervously. Chloe, too, separately sent me a rambling, tearful text message. She apologized vaguely for any misunderstandings, and if she'd inadvertently said anything to upset the bookings, offering to talk to anyone if it would help. They were both desperately testing the waters, hoping I would make the problem magically disappear, or at least reveal that the threat wasn't as severe as the letter implied. They were squirming, and it was delightful. Livia's usually impeccable composure was visibly cracking. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her designer handbag, a lifeline in her sea of anxiety. The faint, cloying scent of Livia's expensive perfume, usually a weapon of social dominance, now seemed to carry a whiff of her anxious sweat. Chloe's text messages were a jumble of typos and desperate pleas, a far cry from her usual cool, sarcastic tone. I maintained a calm, slightly puzzled expression throughout Livia's visit, offering her tea, the picture of innocent hospitality. "Why on earth would you be able to help, Livia?" I asked, my voice dripping with false naivety. "Unless, of course, You happen to know something specific about who made those cancellations. I let the question hang in the air, enjoying the way she paled and stammered. The clinking of fine china teacups in my elegantly appointed living room was the only sound for a moment. The power shift between us palpable, intoxicating. I was no longer the victim. I was the puppet master. I simply smiled sweetly at Livia and said, I'm sure it will all resolve itself one way or another. That consortium seems very persistent, don't they? Then, with perfect timing, Daniel walked in. He announced that our real travel agent had just confirmed our upcoming impromptu makeup trip, a week-long luxury cruise, another fabrication, of course, but one designed to rub salt in Livia's wounds. I turned to Livia, my eyes wide with feigned delight. Isn't that wonderful? We're leaving tomorrow. I left Livia and Chloe to stew in their mounting anxiety and this terrifying prospect of a massive, imaginary lawsuit. What desperate measures would they resort to while I was unreachably enjoying myself on the high seas? Livia, smarting from the honeymoon fiasco and the lingering, though ultimately empty, threat of the fake travel consortium lawsuit, a threat I allowed to quietly fizzle out after a few more terrifying letters, was more determined than ever to undermine me. Her next move was to target my standing within our family and, more critically, my role in the moderately successful family business, a boutique publishing house our father had built. She began a subtle but insidious campaign, poisoning our parents' minds against me. She painted me as reckless and unstable, citing my sudden and erratic change in honeymoon plans, conveniently omitting her role in the original cancellations, and my new, strangely accusatory tone towards her. She artfully suggested that my recent marriage to Daniel, a man they barely knew, and Livia subtly disparaged as not quite up to our family's standards, was making me irresponsible. Her ultimate aim, to convince our parents that I should be removed from my key editorial position at the publishing house, a role I genuinely excelled at and cared for. Or, even more devastatingly, that my portion of a future inheritance should be placed under Livia's sensible and caring management for safekeeping. Our parents, who had always possessed a frustrating blind spot where Livia was concerned and were easily swayed by her crocodile tears and feigned concern, summoned me for a formal family discussion. The confrontation was brutal. They voiced Livia's accusations as their own genuine concerns, threatening my position in the company and hinting at altering their wills if I didn't come to my senses and show more respect for Livia's feelings. The cold, sterile atmosphere of our parents' formal living room, a room reserved for serious discussions and pronouncements, felt instantly oppressive. The familiar, heavy scent of old wood, lemon polish, and simmering disappointment hung in the air, a scent I associated with countless childhood injustices. My father's voice, usually warm, boomed with uncharacteristic severity. My mother wrung her hands, her eyes filled with a mixture of worry and reproach, pleading with me to just apologize to Livia and make peace. Livia herself sat beside our mother, the picture of demure, wounded innocence, occasionally dabbing at a non-existent tear with a lace handkerchief. The feeling of déjà vu was overwhelming, this pattern of Livia's manipulation, her ability to twist narratives and paint herself as the victim, and our parents' infuriating gullibility, was a painfully familiar echo from my first life. The weight of their unfair accusations, the threat to my professional life and financial future, settled upon me like a shroud. My father, his face stern and unyielding, delivered the ultimatum. You will formally apologize to your sister for the undue stress you've caused her. You will accept a more junior, supervised role at the company, reporting directly to Livia. And you will demonstrate a significant change in attitude. If not, Alara, we will be forced to take more permanent steps regarding your involvement in this family and its legacy. His words hung in the air, heavy and final. I allowed my face to crumple with carefully calibrated shock and hurt. Tears welled in my eyes, a trick I'd learned from observing Livia over 2 lifetimes, as I looked from my father's stern face to my mother's pleading one, then to Livia's smugly concealed triumph. I stammered a weak, I don't understand. I never meant to cause anyone stress. I meekly agreed to seriously think about everything they had said. I didn't argue, didn't defend myself, projecting an image of someone cowed and overwhelmed. Before leaving, I even offered a very weak, ambiguous apology directly to Livia. I'm sorry if anything I've done has upset you. This performance seemed to satisfy them, particularly Livia, who clearly believed she had me cornered, my spirit finally broken. My apparent compliance was, once again, a strategic facade. I had been preparing for this exact eventuality since my rebirth. In my first life, I had been a dedicated and innovative editor at the family publishing house, but my significant contributions were consistently overlooked, often subtly credited to Livia by our parents, or dismissed entirely. This time, I was armed. For months, I had been meticulously and discreetly documenting my actual contributions, successful book acquisitions I'd championed, innovative marketing campaigns I'd designed, and significant revenue streams I'd generated. Conversely, I had also compiled a damning shadow ledger of Livia's involvement, the string of vanity projects she'd pushed that had flopped spectacularly, the talented authors she'd alienated with her arrogance, the poor financial decisions she'd influenced, and the general air of entitlement and incompetence she brought to her sinecure position. I had also quietly cultivated allies within the company's senior staff who respected my work ethic and knew my true worth, and among influential authors and industry contacts. My counter-move was to prepare a comprehensive, irrefutable dossier, not for my easily manipulated parents, but for Mr. Albright, our company's most significant minority shareholder, and a sharp, no-nonsense businessman who had been a friend of my grandfather. Furthermore, I'd hired a discreet forensic accountant to subtly investigate the publishing house's finances, suspecting Livia might be siphoning funds for her extravagant lifestyle or mismanaging budgets in ways that were cleverly concealed from our father's less than vigilant oversight. The late nights I spent were not filled with tears of despair, but with focused, methodical activity. The soft glow of my monitor illuminated my determined face as I cross-referenced sales figures, compiled commendation emails, and organized contracts. The crisp, professional feel of the bound dossier, filled with charts, timelines, and testimonials, was immensely satisfying. The secure metallic click of the encrypted USB drive containing a digital copy of all my evidence felt like a weapon in my hand. The strong, invigorating scent of dark roast coffee, brewed in my private study, fueled my efforts. Vivid flashbacks to my first life, where I had possessed no such evidence, no such foresight, only fueled my resolve. This time, I would not be silenced or erased. My quiet confidence grew with each piece of damning evidence I compiled against Livia and each testament to my own value. Livia, brimming with overconfidence after our family discussion and believing me to be thoroughly demoralized, made a spectacularly arrogant and ill-advised blunder at the publishing house. She unilaterally rejected a manuscript from a critically acclaimed, albeit controversial author whom I had been carefully cultivating. She sent him a dismissive and insulting rejection letter. This author was known for his fiery temper and his influential social media presence. What would be the immediate fallout from Livia's reckless act? Livia's colossal blunder exploded with astonishing speed. The rejected author, incandescent with rage at the insulting tone of Livia's letter, which she had foolishly signed with her full name and title, immediately posted a scathing denunciation of our publishing house on all his social media platforms. He included a screenshot of the most offensive passages. His legion of loyal fans erupted in outrage, calling for a boycott. The story was picked up by industry blogs and even some mainstream literary journals, painting Ashworth Publishing, our family business, as amateurish, disrespectful, and out of touch. Simultaneously, as this PR nightmare was unfolding, my meticulously prepared dossier reached Mr. Albright. He was, as I'd anticipated, appalled by what he read, by Livia's consistent pattern of incompetence, sabotage, and potential financial impropriety. He was equally impressed by my documented successes and professionalism. He immediately called an emergency meeting with my parents, laying out the stark, undeniable evidence from my dossier, including the early findings from the forensic accountant, which hinted at significant unexplained expenses linked to Livia's projects. He then confronted them with the current crisis involving the rejected author, a crisis Livia had single-handedly created. My parents were stunned into horrified silence, the carefully constructed image of their dutiful, capable Livia shattered before their eyes. They realized with dawning terror that Livia had not only been playing them for fools, but was actively, catastrophically damaging the family legacy they cherished. The publishing house faced an immediate, severe crisis of reputation and potential financial loss. The atmosphere in the emergency board meeting, which Mr. Albright insisted I attend, much to my parents' discomfort, was thick with tension and unspoken accusations. The cold, hard facts presented in my dossier, sales figures, Project P and L's, timelines of Livia's interference were irrefutable. Mr. Albright's voice was stern, his disappointment in my parents' oversight palpable. My parents' faces were a mask of dawning realization, shame, and fear. Frantic phone calls were made as they, along with Mr. Albright and other senior staff, tried to mitigate the damage from Livia's disastrous author rejection. The normally comforting, familiar scent of old books and printing ink in the company's boardroom now seemed tainted with the stale air of crisis and fear. Livia was summoned to the meeting, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to break over her head, likely expecting to witness my final censure. Livia swept into the boardroom, a confident, almost triumphant smirk on her face, clearly expecting to see me further disciplined or even dismissed. Her smirk vanished instantly as she took in the grim faces of Mr. Albright and our parents, and my own calm, observant presence. Her eyes darted around, confusion warring with a flicker of nascent panic. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice suddenly small. What would be her immediate defense when confronted with the full scale of her incompetence and the crisis she had caused? Confronted with the irrefutable evidence of her disastrous handling of the author, the damning contents of my dossier, Mr. Albright's icy fury, and our parents' shocked, accusatory stares, Livia's carefully constructed composure shattered. She tried to lie, to bluster, to shift blame onto a junior assistant, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Her denials grew weaker, then dissolved into a torrent of hysterical tears and desperate, incoherent apologies. She begged me, Mr. Albright, and our parents for forgiveness, for another chance. She hysterically pleaded that she could fix it, that she just made a little mistake, that she never meant for any of this to happen. Our parents, deeply ashamed of their own blindness, terrified for the future of the business their father had built, and now facing the public humiliation Livia had brought upon them, turned their pleading eyes to me. They apologized profusely, repeatedly, for doubting me, for pressuring me, for their blatant favoritism. They begged me, their voices choked with emotion, to step in, to use my skills and contacts to fix Livia's catastrophic mess, to save the company. They appealed desperately to my sense of family loyalty and my well-known competence. "Please, Alara," my mother sobbed, clutching my hand. "You're the only one who can help us now." Livia's desperate, ugly crying was a far cry from her usual poised, manipulative tears. This was the raw sound of genuine panic and a crumbling ego. Our parents' humbled, pleading voices were a stark, almost pathetic contrast to their earlier arrogance and authoritative pronouncements. I remained calm, my expression carefully neutral, observing the wreckage of Livia's making. The heavy silence in the room, broken only by Livia's gulping sobs and our parents' whispered pleas, was a testament to the dramatic shift in power. The scent of expensive, wilting flowers in a vase on the polished boardroom table seemed to mirror Livia's own wilting fortunes. I looked from Livia's tear-streaked, contorted face to my parents' aged, worried ones. A flicker of old, familiar pain momentarily surfaced, quickly superseded by a new, steely resolve. They had made their bed, now they were lying in it. I finally spoke, my voice quiet but firm, cutting through Livia's sobs. "I will consider what needs to be done," I said, my gaze sweeping over them, "for the sake of the company's dedicated employees and the authors who depend on us." I offered no forgiveness to Livia, no immediate absolution to my parents. I agreed to assess the damage and propose a recovery plan, but it was clear this would be entirely on my terms. What would those terms be, and would they be willing to accept them? Just as the dust was beginning to settle from the publishing house crisis, which I had agreed to help salvage, but under strict conditions that significantly curtailed Livia's and my parents' influence, a ghost from my past reappeared. Marcus Thorne. He was my charming, feckless, and ultimately treacherous fiancé from my first life. Livia, ever the opportunist and desperate to regain some semblance of power and social standing after her spectacular professional humiliation, had somehow unearthed him. She began a very public, very ostentatious romance. Marcus, whom Livia had also coveted in our previous life and possibly even conspired with to get rid of me, was now her latest prize. They flaunted their whirlwind relationship across social media, their posts dripping with smug coupledom and carefully curated luxury. There were subtle, unmistakable digs at me captions about finding true happiness after escaping a toxic past, or Marcus gushing about Livia's passion and vibrancy, qualities he implied I lacked. Livia, I suspected, was trying to use Marcus's possibly exaggerated connections and his veneer of old money wealth, a facade I knew from bitter experience might be entirely hollow, to launch a new venture. Perhaps a lifestyle brand, or simply to try and socially rehabilitate herself and isolate me and Daniel further. Marcus, as weak-willed, opportunistic, and susceptible to flattery as ever, seemed to be lapping up Livia's attention and adoration, readily playing his part in her pathetic comeback tour. The initial shock of seeing Marcus's familiar, handsome face plastered across Livia's Instagram feed was a fleeting cold echo from a past I had largely buried. This time, however, there was no lingering heartbreak, only a cool, detached assessment and a weary sense of predictability. The gaudy, performative nature of their social media posts, champagne toasts on yachts I suspected were rented by the hour, strategically candid shots in front of landmarks, was almost comical in its desperation. The faint, unpleasant scent of Marcus's signature sandalwood cologne, a scent I once associated with love and now only with betrayal, seemed to waft from my phone screen. Livia, naturally, made several triumphant calls to share her wonderful news with me, her voice practically vibrating with malicious glee. I offered polite, utterly indifferent congratulations, my lack of reaction clearly infuriating her. Daniel's quiet, unwavering support during this period was a balm, his solid presence a stark, comforting contrast to Marcus's remembered superficiality and deceit. He saw Livia and Marcus for exactly what they were, a desperate, grasping pair. Livia and Marcus, in a move of breathtaking audacity, announced a lavish engagement party at one of the city's most exclusive venues. They made a great show of hand-delivering a thick, cream-colored invitation to me and Daniel, Livia's eyes glittering with malicious anticipation. It was clearly intended as a public spectacle, a chance to rub their supposed happiness and success in my face. Would I dare to attend their carefully orchestrated triumph? To Livia's surprise, and I imagine slight disappointment, I politely and promptly RSVP'd yes to their engagement party. I even sent a small, tasteful, and entirely innocuous engagement gift, a silver picture frame, with a blandly worded congratulatory note. I expressed sincere happiness for Livia and Marcus whenever our paths crossed or when mutual acquaintances brought them up. My performance of serene acceptance led them, and others, to believe I was either genuinely unaffected or secretly bitter but too proud to show it. I studiously avoided any engagement with their online provocations, maintaining a dignified silence that I knew would irk Livia far more than any outburst. My acceptance of their invitation was not an act of forgiveness or indifference. It was a calculated move. I remembered Marcus Thorne far too well. In my first life, his charm had masked a multitude of sins, significant gambling debts, a string of failed, shady business ventures, a tendency to grossly embellish his successes, and a parasitic reliance on the women in his life. I immediately set my discreet private investigator, the same one who had tracked Livia's IP address, to work on uncovering Marcus's current financial situation and any recent indiscretions. It didn't take long. My PI confirmed that Marcus was indeed deeply in debt again, his supposed old money long since squandered. He was living well beyond his means, likely funded by a desperate Livia who was herself financially strained after her recent professional downfall. I also discovered he was currently entangled with a rather unsavory character, a known loan shark with a reputation for brutal collection methods. My plan was simple, to expose Marcus not just to Livia, but to the very society Livia was so desperately trying to impress. and to do so in a way that would also irrevocably highlight Livia's appalling judgment, her desperation, and her complicity in his charade. I decided against a direct confrontation. Instead, I anonymously tipped off a notoriously tenacious investigative journalist at a popular city tabloid. I provided her with a carefully curated package of evidence regarding Marcus's debts, his fraudulent business claims, and his association with the loan shark. I timed the leak perfectly. My research into Marcus's current life was conducted with cold precision. The quiet click of my mouse in my secure home study, the city lights gleaming like scattered diamonds far below my window, was the soundtrack to my meticulous planning. I sifted through online records, social media footprints, and discreetly contacted a few old acquaintances from my past life who had also been burned by Marcus. The contrast between the glittering, aspirational public image Livia and Marcus were desperately projecting and the sordid, debt-ridden reality I was uncovering was stark. I felt a grim, almost clinical satisfaction, not born of jealousy, but of a desire for truth and a reckoning for past betrayals. The faint, musty scent of old financial statements and legal documents my PI had unearthed, pertaining to Marcus's previous scams, filled my study, a reminder of his unchanging nature. I was setting the stage for a truly unforgettable engagement party. My PI uncovered one particularly explosive piece of information. Marcus was not only broke, but was also being actively pursued for defaulting on a very large, very recent loan taken out under false pretenses. He had used forged documents that implicated Livia as his guarantor. The loan shark was losing patience. This information was set to become dramatically public knowledge on the very day of their grand engagement party. What form would this public revelation take? The day of Livia and Marcus's grand engagement party arrived, a glittering affair held at the Crystal Ballroom, one of the city's most ostentatiously expensive venues. Guests dressed in their finest mingled under sparkling chandeliers, sipping champagne. Just as Livia, radiant in a custom-made gown, and Marcus, looking smugly handsome in a tailored tuxedo, were about to make their grand entrance to a flourish of trumpets, the storm broke. The investigative journalist's explosive exposé on Marcus Thorne hit the internet. It was splashed across the homepage of the city's most read tabloid website, complete with damning evidence of his massive debts, his fraudulent business history, and, most sensationally, details of the loan shark's aggressive pursuit. Copies of the forged loan documents clearly showing Livia's forged signature as guarantor were included. Simultaneously, several of Marcus's other creditors, emboldened by the article and likely tipped off by the loan shark, or my PI, chose that exact moment to make their presence known. Uniformed bailiffs began discreetly serving legal notices to Marcus amidst the horrified guests. Smartphones buzzed and lit up across the ballroom as the scandalous news spread like wildfire. Whispers turned into gasps. Guests started checking their phones, their expressions shifting from polite interest to shock and disgust. Some, particularly those with a keen sense of financial propriety or a fear of scandal by association, began to make quiet, hasty exits. Livia's dream party, her carefully orchestrated moment of social triumph, was rapidly imploding into a public relations nightmare of epic proportions. Marcus was exposed as a con artist and a deadbeat. Livia was revealed as either a gullible fool for being so thoroughly duped, or worse, a willing accomplice in his fraudulent schemes. The lavish decorations, the gourmet food, the expensive champagne, it all suddenly seemed like a desperate, pathetic charade built on a foundation of lies and bad credit. The glittering chandeliers of the Crystal Ballroom seemed to mock the unfolding disaster, their light reflecting the panicked, horrified faces of the remaining guests. The celebratory music stuttered and died as a wave of shocked silence, punctuated by urgent whispers and the clicking of phone cameras, swept through the room. Livia's frozen, triumphant smile melted into a mask of disbelief, then dawning horror as she saw the article on a guest's phone. Marcus's charming facade cracked, revealing the desperate, cornered rat beneath. He attempted pathetic, blustering denials, but the evidence was too compelling, the bailiffs too real. The tantalizing scent of expensive food from the untouched buffet now mingled with the acrid smell of fear and social ruin. Daniel and I arrived fashionably late, as planned, just in time to witness the spectacular implosion. I observed the chaos with a calm, almost serene detachment, even offering a sympathetic word to a distraught acquaintance of Livia's who was wringing her hands. Such a dreadful scandal, I murmured, shaking my head sadly. Marcus, cornered, humiliated, and desperate to deflect blame, suddenly pointed an accusing finger at a stunned Livia. She knew, he shouted, his voice cracking. She knew all about my debts. She was the one who pushed me into this. She forged those guarantor documents herself. This whole party was her idea to try and impress people because she's the one who's really broke. The remaining guests gasped. Who would they believe in this sordid, he said, she said? Marcus's desperate public accusation against Livia sent a fresh wave of shock and lurid speculation through the rapidly emptying ballroom. He continued to rant, trying to paint himself as Livia's victim, a pawn in her ambitious, fraudulent schemes. Livia, completely humiliated, her reputation in tatters, and now facing the terrifying prospect of being implicated in Marcus's financial crimes and pursued by a ruthless loan shark, finally broke. The carefully constructed artifice of her life shattered around her. The cost of the extravagant, now disastrous party alone was enough to push her to the brink of financial ruin, especially after her diminished role and income at the family publishing house. In the days that followed, as the scandal dominated gossip columns and her social circle evaporated, Livia became a pariah. Marcus, having thoroughly implicated her, vanished, leaving her to face the fallout alone. It was in this state of utter desperation, her arrogance finally and completely extinguished, that Livia sought me out. She appeared at my doorstep unannounced, a disheveled, tear-streaked wreck, a stark, pathetic contrast to her usual polished, imperious self. She begged me, her voice hoarse and broken, for help, for money, for a way out of the catastrophic mess Marcus had left her in. She even, in a moment of what seemed like genuine, albeit self-pitying insight, admitted, "You were always the smart one, Alara. I should have listened to you. I should have been a better sister." Even Marcus, a few days later, had the audacity to call me. His voice oozed false contrition, attempting to gain my sympathy or perhaps strike some sort of deal, hoping I could use my influence to make his problems disappear. Livia's appearance at my door was shocking. Her expensive clothes were rumpled, her makeup smeared, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. The raw, animalistic desperation in her voice was unnerving. She clung to my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve as she poured out her tale of woe, a torrent of self-pity, fear, and belated, self-serving regret. Marcus's phone call was equally contemptible, his slimy attempts to manipulate me a pathetic echo of his past behavior. The setting for Livia's begging was my own calm, elegantly minimalist apartment, a space that radiated the quiet success and order I had built for myself, a stark contrast to the chaos and ruin of her life. The faint, clean scent of white tea and bamboo from my diffuser seemed to highlight the stale, cheap desperation clinging to Livia. I listened to her tirade, to Marcus's wheedling, my expression carefully unyielding, my resolve hardening with every pathetic plea. This was the culmination of their choices, the inevitable consequence of their greed and malice. I looked at the ruined figure of my sister sobbing at my feet and recalled the oily voice of Marcus on the phone. They had systematically tried to destroy my happiness, my career, my peace of mind, not once but twice. My revenge had been precise, silent, and devastating. Was it finally complete? Or was there one more final piece of the puzzle that needed to fall into place before the ultimate power shift, the grand reveal of who I truly was in this new life? Following Livia's spectacular public downfall with Marcus, the repercussions rippled outwards, threatening to engulf what remained of our family's stability. The family publishing house, Ashworth Publishing, already reeling from Livia's earlier blunder with the author, faced a fresh wave of negative publicity. Its association with the now infamous Livia Thorne, she had, in her hubris, already started using Marcus's surname, was toxic. Key advertisers became skittish, and some long-standing authors expressed concerns. Livia's personal debts, particularly the looming threat from Marcus's loan shark, who now believed Livia was good for the money due to her family connections, threatened to drag our parents into a financial quagmire they were ill-equipped to handle. My parents, having witnessed my competence in beginning to salvage the publishing house but still utterly unaware of my true capabilities or resources, made one last desperate appeal. They summoned me to the old family home. The air was thick with the scent of dust, despair, and stale coffee. They laid out the dire financial situation, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. They didn't just ask for my guidance this time, they begged for a significant financial bailout, a sum they clearly believed was far beyond my reach. My father, his voice heavy with defeat, even suggested I consider selling my apartment or taking out substantial personal loans to help. Livia was present, a pale, silent ghost haunting the edges of the room, completely dependent, her spirit seemingly crushed. This moment, their utter helplessness, their complete reliance on me, the daughter they had consistently underestimated and allowed to be tormented, was the precise catalyst I had been waiting for. The oppressive silence in the familiar, faded grandeur of the family living room was broken only by my mother's occasional sniffle and the rustle of bleak financial statements. My parents looked older, smaller, their usual authority replaced by a humbling desperation. Livia, huddled in an armchair, stared listlessly out the window, a shadow of her former, vibrant, malicious self. The stark, uncompromising figures on the spreadsheets, spread across the antique mahogany table, told a grim story of impending ruin. I observed their collective despair with a strange, profound calm welling within me. This wasn't about savoring their suffering. It was about the imminent, final liberation of myself from their dysfunctional orbit. This was the moment the power dynamic would shift, irrevocably and forever. My father, his shoulders slumped, looked at me with a mixture of hope and despair. "Alara," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "There's no other way. We're going to lose everything, the business, this house, our reputation. You're our only hope, but even your resourcefulness. Well, you can't possibly pull a miracle of this magnitude out of thin air, can you?" His question, laden with their ingrained underestimation of me, hung heavy in the stale air. I let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing the weight of their desperation to fully settle. Then, I calmly, methodically, began my revelation. "Actually, Father," I said, my voice even and clear, "I believe I can. I explained that in my first life, before my ill-fated engagement to Marcus, I had been on the cusp of a major breakthrough. I had developed a revolutionary piece of educational software, an adaptive learning platform. But I had shelved the project due to the pressures of my upcoming marriage and Livia's subtle, insidious campaign to undermine my confidence and focus. Upon my rebirth, armed with the bitter knowledge of my past and a burning desire for true independence, I had secretly resurrected that project. Operating under a carefully constructed pseudonym, E. Vance, and through a discreetly established international trust, I had meticulously rebuilt, refined, and launched the software. It had, over the past few years, become an unexpected global success, adopted by educational institutions worldwide. I was E. Vance, the anonymous, highly successful, and, as it turned out, rather wealthy CEO of Phoenix Learning Systems. As I spoke, I calmly retrieved a sleek, encrypted tablet from my briefcase. With a few swift taps, I accessed a secure online portal, bringing up the Phoenix Learning Systems dashboard. It displayed impressive user statistics and revenue figures. I then made a brief video call to my second-in-command, a brilliant COO I had headhunted. He respectfully addressed me as Miss Vance and confirmed a few key details I requested. The stunned, incredulous silence that filled the room was profound. My parents stared, mouths agape, their faces paling with disbelief. Livia slowly turned from the window, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something unreadable. Perhaps the dawning, horrifying realization of just how profoundly she had misjudged me. I detailed the hard work, the late nights, the strategic decisions, the sheer force of will it had taken to build this empire in secret, all while navigating their family dramas and Livia's machinations. The revelation took place not in their decaying, gloomy house, but metaphorically, in the gleaming modern world of my success. A world symbolized by the cool, metallic sheen of my tablet, the crisp efficiency of my COO, and the quiet, unshakable confidence in my voice. The air, once thick with despair, now crackled with the energy of this astonishing, game-changing truth. The faint, clean scent of my leather briefcase mingled with the musty odor of their old home, a symbolic clash of two worlds. Livia, her voice a hoarse whisper, finally broke the silence. You? Phoenix learning? But how? You were always just Ilara, quiet, predictable Ilara. Her words, meant to be a confused observation, dripped with the unconscious arrogance of her lifelong dismissal of me. What exactly was the true, staggering extent of my hidden power and influence? I smiled faintly at Livia's incredulous question. Precisely, Livia, just Ilara, the one none of you ever truly saw. I then proceeded to elaborate on the true scale of my wealth, and more importantly, my influence. Phoenix Learning Systems wasn't just a modest success. It was a multi-million-dollar international corporation with significant leverage in the tech and education sectors. I explained that the loyal caterer at my wedding, Mrs. Albright, was in fact the retired CFO of a company I had strategically invested in. She was a woman who owed me a significant favor from my past life, which I had called in. The discreet contact at Daniel's company who had verified the fake recall notice was the head of their IT security. He was a man whose career I had inadvertently saved years ago, in my first life, by uncovering a major embezzlement scheme, and who was now a fiercely loyal ally. The private investigator was the head of a top-tier corporate security firm that Phoenix Learning Systems had on retainer. Even Mr. Albright, the influential minority shareholder at Ashworth Publishing, was not just an old family friend. He was also a silent, early-stage investor in Phoenix Learning Systems. He was a mentor I had reconnected with upon my rebirth, who had believed in Evance from the start and whose loyalty was now absolute. I revealed that I had possessed the financial resources and strategic capability to crush their petty schemes, expose Livia's malice, and dismantle Marcus's frauds from the very beginning. I could have saved Ashworth Publishing with a snap of my fingers, but I had chosen not to. I had chosen to let them play out their hands, to allow them to expose their true natures through their own actions, their own greed, their own cruelty. I could easily resolve their current financial crisis, pay off Livia's debts to the loan shark, and restore Ashworth Publishing to solvency. But it would be entirely my choice, my terms, not an obligation born of familial duty or their desperate pleas. I presented this information calmly, factually, without a trace of gloating or triumph. I let the implications of my words sink in. Quick, almost cinematic flashbacks could illustrate these connections. A brief scene of me meeting with Mrs. Albright, a coded conversation with Daniel's IT contact, a strategic discussion with Mr. Albright about his investment in Evance. My parents and Livia listened, their faces a kaleidoscope of emotions. Shock, awe, shame, and a dawning, terrifying understanding of how thoroughly they had underestimated me, how comprehensively I had outmaneuvered them at every turn. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been utterly and irrevocably inverted. They were no longer dealing with Ilara, the quiet, downtrodden daughter and sister. They were facing Evance, a formidable, self-made woman of immense means and influence. The cool, smooth surface of the antique mahogany table between us seemed to symbolize the vast, unbridgeable gulf that now separated my reality from theirs. My mother, her voice trembling, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange, dawning respect, finally spoke. So, all this time, all those incidents, you were just watching us? Letting Livia? The unspoken accusation, the horror of realizing they had been observed, their malice noted, their downfall perhaps even subtly guided, hung heavy and suffocating in the air. I met my mother's gaze, my own expression calm, unwavering. I was observing, I corrected gently, and I was protecting myself. My rebirth gave me a clarity I lacked before, a chance to build a life where I would never again be a victim of anyone's malice or negligence. I didn't apologize for my methods, nor did I offer false comfort. I stated facts, my voice devoid of accusation but firm with self-possession. I explained that my priority had been to secure my own safety, happiness, and independence first. Now, from this position of strength, I was willing to offer a very specific, limited form of assistance to my parents. I would ensure they had a comfortable, financially secure retirement, perhaps by establishing a trust for them, completely separate from Ashworth Publishing. I would also offer to buy out Ashworth Publishing entirely at a fair market value, with the intention of restructuring it properly, professionally, and without Livia's or their continued mismanagement. This would preserve my grandfather's legacy, but on my terms. I made it unequivocally clear, however, that my personal relationship with them, and especially with Livia, could never return to what it once was. Nor would I tolerate any future attempts at manipulation or emotional blackmail. Daniel, who had known the full extent of my success as E. Vance for some time, a revelation that had only deepened his love and admiration for me, entered the room at that moment. He was a silent, supportive presence by my side, a true partner in every sense. His hand on my shoulder was a quiet affirmation of our united front. My calm, unwavering gaze met each of theirs in turn. The finality in my tone brooked no argument. My parents' reactions were a complex tapestry of profound relief at the prospect of financial salvation, deep shame at their past behavior, a grudging awe at my achievements, and a palpable fear of this new, powerful Ilara. Livia was utterly devastated, the last vestiges of her manipulative power base crumbling to dust. She stared at me, her expression blank, finally realizing she had no leverage, no angle, no way to control or influence this version of her sister. The quiet, solid strength of Daniel's support was a visible testament to the healthy, equitable relationship I now had. I outlined my terms for any assistance with Ashworth Publishing, complete operational control, a thorough audit, and no sinecures for family members. These terms were non-negotiable and prioritized sound business principles and my own well-being. The fresh, clean scent of the spring air drifting through an open window, carrying the distant sounds of city life, seemed to symbolize the new, expansive future I had claimed for myself, a future in which they would play only a small, carefully defined and conditional role. Livia, in a last, desperate, pathetic attempt to find some purchase, some emotional leverage, her voice cracking with a final plea, cried out, "But we're sisters, Ilara, blood! We shared a childhood. Doesn't that mean anything to you anymore? Can you truly be this cold?" How would I respond to this raw, albeit manipulative, emotional appeal, the last arrow in her depleted quiver? A few days after the earth-shattering revelation of my true identity and resources, Livia requested a private meeting. She chose a small, neutral cafe downtown, a place devoid of personal history for either of us. It was a sign, perhaps, of her diminished confidence. She arrived looking uncharacteristically subdued, her usually vibrant attire replaced with muted tones, her makeup minimal. The Livia who sat opposite me, nervously stirring her untouched latte, was a pale imitation of the imperious tormentor I had known. She launched into a carefully constructed, almost rehearsed apology. She spoke of shared childhood memories, conveniently glossing over her cruelty and highlighting moments of manufactured sisterly affection. She referred to her actions as youthful mistakes, driven by foolish jealousy of my quiet strength and intelligence, qualities she now claimed to have always admired. She swore she had learned her lesson, that her recent public humiliation had been a profoundly humbling experience. With tears welling in her eyes, tears that, for the first time, seemed to possess a hint of genuine despair beneath the practiced manipulation, she begged for a chance to rebuild our sisterly bond. She even, astonishingly, offered to work for me at Phoenix Learning Systems in any menial position to prove her sincerity and learn from me. Her apology, while containing glimmers of what might have been genuine remorse, was still heavily tinged with a desperate, fawning respect. It felt just as false and self-serving as her previous malice. She was still, at her core, looking for an angle, a way back into a position of comfort and advantage. The setting of the anonymous cafe, with its bustling background noise and the impersonal aroma of coffee beans and sugary pastries, served to underscore the transactional nature of her plea. It was a performance, albeit a desperate one. Livia's voice, usually so confident and cutting, held a noticeable tremor as she delivered her speech. Her gaze flicked between my face and her nervously twisting hands. I listened patiently, my expression carefully neutral, sipping my black coffee, offering no verbal or nonverbal encouragement. I noted the subtle tells, the way her eyes avoided mine at key moments of her confession, the slight tightening of her lips when she mentioned her admiration for me. The Livia before me was a creature stripped of her power, flailing for a lifeline, and her apology was the best performance she could muster under duress. The clatter of crockery and the murmur of other conversations formed a mundane backdrop to this extraordinary moment of her capitulation. Livia concluded her long, rambling plea, her voice thick with emotion, her eyes searching mine desperately. "I'll do anything, Alara. Anything you ask. Just tell me there's hope for us. For me. Please." She leaned forward, her hands clasped beseechingly on the small table between us. The air crackled with her desperate hope. I remained silent for a long, deliberate moment, letting her words hang between us. What would be my first, carefully chosen word in response? I met Livia's desperate, tear-filled gaze directly, my own expression clear, steady, and devoid of malice, yet utterly resolute. After a moment that stretched into an uncomfortable eternity for her, I spoke. My voice was quiet but firm, carrying easily over the cafe's low hum. "No, Livia." The word, simple and unequivocal, landed with the force of a physical blow. Livia visibly flinched, her face crumpling. I elaborated briefly, calmly, without a trace of anger or vindictiveness. My tone was measured and almost gentle, yet unyielding. "I understand you're in pain," I said, "and perhaps you believe some of what you've just said. But forgiveness for me isn't about forgetting the deliberate, repeated, and calculated harm you inflicted over many years, in 2 lifetimes. It's not about erasing the past or pretending your actions didn't have severe consequences. For me, and ultimately for yourself." I paused, letting that sink in. "My peace, Livia," I continued, "the peace I have fought so hard to build in this new life, requires distance. It requires a definitive end to the toxic dynamic that defined our relationship." I acknowledged her current suffering, but gently stated that it was a direct consequence of her own choices, her own actions. It was not my responsibility to alleviate it or rescue her from it. "I genuinely wish you well in finding your own path, Livia," I concluded, my voice softening slightly. "A path towards genuine self-awareness and perhaps, eventually, your own peace. But that path will not, cannot involve me." The finality in my tone was absolute, leaving no room for negotiation or further pleas. Livia's face, which had held a fragile hope, completely crumbled. The carefully constructed facade of her apology dissolved, revealing the raw despair beneath. There was no shouting from me, no dramatic recriminations, no lingering bitterness in my voice, just quiet, firm, and irrevocable resolution. The ordinary background noise of the cafe, the clinking of cups, the soft chatter of other patrons, the hiss of the espresso machine continued, utterly indifferent to the monumental collapse of Livia's world. I placed a few crisp bills on the table, more than enough to cover our coffees, a small, impersonal gesture of severance, of finality. As I rose to leave, I felt a profound, almost physical sensation of a heavy, ancient weight lifting from my shoulders, a sense of liberation so complete it was almost dizzying. Livia stared at me, aghast, her mouth slightly open, the unshed tears now streaming freely down her pale cheeks. But what am I supposed to do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, raw with a dawning terror. Her entire world order, built on manipulating or relying on others, particularly me, had just been obliterated. She was facing true, terrifying independence for the first time in her life. My next difficult conversation was with my parents. They requested to see me, and I agreed to meet them, but on my own turf. The spacious, light-filled conference room of my company, Phoenix Learning Systems. The sleek, modern environment, a testament to my success and independence, served as a subtle but powerful reminder of the new dynamic. They arrived looking diminished, older, their usual parental authority entirely absent. They offered their own apologies, which felt more genuinely rooted in shame and regret than Livia's, yet they were still undeniably colored by their own needs, their fears for their future, and their deep-seated desire for a return to some semblance of familial normalcy, however dysfunctional. They expressed profound shame for their lifelong blindness to Livia's manipulations, for their blatant favoritism, for failing to protect me, for actively contributing to my suffering. My mother wept openly, recounting specific instances of their unfairness, her words choked with belated remorse. My father, his voice hoarse, spoke of his regret at not seeing my true worth sooner. They pleaded with me not to cut them out of my life completely, appealing to my sense of familial duty for the sake of appearances within their social circle and for their own emotional comfort in their declining years. They were also, I sensed, deeply worried about their own future and social standing if I, their now powerful and influential daughter, were to publicly and completely disown them, despite the financial arrangements I had already put in place for their security. The vast, polished expanse of the boardroom table physically separated us, a metaphor for the emotional distance I now maintained. The scent of Success high-quality leather, fresh flowers, the subtle aroma of brewing coffee from a nearby machine permeated the air. It was a stark contrast to the musty scent of regret that seemed to cling to my parents. Their voices were softer now, stripped of their former confident, often critical tones. They recounted their failings with a painful honesty that I had never heard from them before, acknowledging specific hurts, specific moments of betrayal. I listened patiently, my expression compassionate yet firm, allowing them to unburden themselves but offering no easy absolution. The panoramic view of the vibrant, bustling city from the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me served as a constant reminder of the expansive, successful life I had built for myself, a life that no longer revolved around their approval or their needs. My mother, her face streaked with tears, reached across the table, her hand trembling as she sought mine. "We made terrible, unforgivable mistakes, Ilara. We know that now, but we are still your parents. We love you. Can you truly, in your heart, turn your back on us completely, erase us from your life?" Her plea, raw and desperate, hung in the sterile air of the conference room. I allowed my mother to take my hand, her touch surprisingly frail. I met her tearful gaze with a gentle but unwavering look. "No," I said softly. "I cannot simply go back to how things were. That family, that dynamic, was irrevocably broken, and it almost broke me twice." I paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle. "However," I continued, my tone shifting slightly, "I am not turning my back on the possibility of a new kind of relationship, a very different one. It must be built on a foundation of genuine honesty, mutual respect, and clearly defined, consistently honored boundaries." I reiterated that I would, as promised, ensure their complete financial security, allowing them a comfortable and dignified retirement. This would be free from the stresses of Ashworth Publishing, which I was now in the process of acquiring and restructuring under new professional management. But I made it absolutely clear that I would not be their emotional crutch, nor would I allow them to ever again enable Livia's toxicity or attempt to draw me back into their old destructive patterns. "Any future relationship we have," I stated calmly, "will be entirely on my terms. It will likely involve limited contact, especially initially, and it will be absolutely contingent on your genuine, sustained change in behavior, your demonstrable respect for my boundaries, and your complete acceptance of my decisions regarding Livia." I emphasized that my primary focus, my absolute priority, was my own well-being, my marriage to Daniel, and the peaceful, fulfilling life I was building. My words were carefully chosen, devoid of any lingering bitterness or accusation, but infused with an unshakable sense of self-preservation and hard-won wisdom. I outlined a few specific, non-negotiable conditions for future interactions: scheduled monthly calls, no unsolicited visits, no discussion of Livia unless initiated by me, and absolutely no attempts to guilt trip or manipulate me. My parents' reaction was a complex mixture of profound sadness at the loss of the old family unit, however flawed, reluctant acceptance of my terms, and perhaps, for the first time, a dawning true understanding of the depth of the hurt they had caused and the strength I had found. The vast, glittering cityscape visible from the conference room window seemed to symbolize the expansive, independent future I had forged for myself, a future in which they could be a small, distant, but respected part if they chose to earn that place. As the difficult meeting with my parents concluded, a notification pinged on my phone. It was a tentative, hesitant text message from Chloe, my former best friend, now Livia's discarded accomplice. "Ilara," it read, "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm so, so sorry for everything. If you could ever find it in your heart to just talk." I'd be grateful. Would I offer her a chance at redemption, however small, or was that particular bridge well and truly burned to ashes? My path to complete liberation required addressing all lingering threads from my toxic past. Chloe's text message, while perhaps sincere in its remorse, represented a connection to a period of betrayal I was determined to leave behind. After careful consideration, I composed a polite but firm response. I acknowledged her apology, but stated clearly that while I wished her no ill will, the damage done to our friendship, and her complicity in Livia's schemes, was too profound for reconciliation. I wished her well in her own life, but made it clear that a renewed friendship was not possible. As for Marcus Thorne, any further attempts he made to contact me, a wheedling voicemail, a desperate email forwarded by a clueless mutual acquaintance, were met with a wall of dignified silence. In one particularly persistent instance, a sharply worded cease and desist letter from Phoenix Learning Systems' formidable legal counsel was dispatched. I was systematically, calmly, and dispassionately closing every door, sealing off every potential avenue through which the toxicity of my past life could seep into my present. My focus was entirely and joyfully on the future I was building with Daniel. The impersonal nature of these final dismissals was deliberate. A concise text message to Chloe, a formal legal letter to Marcus. No emotional energy was wasted, no unnecessary drama indulged. It was the emotional equivalent of tidying up a long-neglected room, sweeping out the last vestiges of dust and debris. I found myself deleting old phone numbers from my contacts, archiving old, painful email exchanges, and blocking certain social media profiles. Each action brought a fresh wave of liberating lightness. The quiet, reassuring hum of my state-of-the-art home security system, with its multiple layers of protection, became a comforting metaphor for the new, impenetrable boundaries I had successfully established around my life and my heart. I was finally, truly safe and in control. With all these old, painful ties addressed and definitively severed, I turned to Daniel, who had been my silent, unwavering support throughout this final, difficult phase. A genuine, unburdened smile spread across my face, the first truly carefree smile I had allowed myself in what felt like an eternity. "It's done," I said, my voice filled with a profound sense of peace and finality. "It's really, finally done." He smiled back, his eyes full of love and pride. What did our immediate, unencumbered future now hold?